Today in an episode that I'm calling Yank versus Tank, we're taking a look at two of the most capable off-road vehicles you can buy in North America. Now you might be wondering, why are we looking at a Grenadier versus a Wrangler instead of maybe a Grenadier versus a Bronco or Bronco versus Wrangler, etc.? The reason is these two vehicles have actually quite a bit more in common than you might think, even though this one is made by a relatively new company. It's their first vehicle they've ever made, although Ineos has been around for a while, and it definitely has a decidedly British/German look to it. This actually has a body-on-frame design with solid axles front and rear, lockers front and rear, and that is suspiciously similar to the Wrangler, which is one of the last vehicles in North America to offer that same feature set. The Bronco, for instance, it has a locker up front available, but it comes with an independent front suspension, not a solid axle like we have in the Wrangler. Now, there are still, of course, plenty of differences between the two, and that's what this video is about. We're not going to take them rugged off-roading because A, I don't want to damage the body on either of them. This Wrangler belongs to Jeep. That Grenadier belongs to us because we actually bought this long-term Grenadier for our testing here. And one of the things I have yet to do, but I keep meaning to, is swap in more appropriate off-road tires. So this model right here, this one has Bridgestone Dueler all-terrain tires on it. They are all-terrain, but as you can see over here on the Wrangler, if we move this direction, they're not as aggressive in terms of the tread pattern as what we find over here on the Wrangler. And it is a bigger vehicle. That's one of the things we should talk about first, perhaps, is just the size of these. And I will whip out my notes to make sure that I don't get any of these numbers wrong, because I know people hate it when that happens. So the big thing you'll notice is the width of the vehicle. Absolute body width, the Wrangler's only 1 inch narrower than the Grenadier, even though visually it appears an awful lot smaller. And that's of course because the hood is much narrower, it really tucks in there, and the body itself is quite a bit narrower, excluding the fenders. The track width, however, and actually the distance from the outside of the one tire on one side to the tire on the other side, it's almost exactly the same. These two vehicles, as equipped here, only about ½ inch difference in terms of the exact width rolling down the road and how wide they are. The Grenadier, though, it is significantly taller, as you can see here. It's about 6 inches taller, almost 7 inches taller than the Wrangler. Big difference in the height. Ground clearance, that's actually pretty similar. So ground clearance in this Grenadier here, 10.4 inches. This exact Rubicon, 10.8 inches. So very similar ground clearance figures as well. But if we come along to the side of this particular Rubicon model, you'll notice that this is not the model with the most aggressive off-road package available, because you can take this up to 12.9 inches of clearance. Now, an important thing to remember with any sort of solid axle vehicle like this is that ground clearance is going to be determined by the tire size, the tire diameter. The only way to get this to have greater clearance over the differential, front or rear, is to increase the diameter of the tires, because it's not an independent suspension vehicle. You'll really notice the difference in roof height back here. This is significantly lower, and this particular model does not actually have a hard top. It may look like it does, but this actually has the powered soft top, which is, again, my favorite top version there. The difference in dimensions is really obvious if we come back here to the rear. Now, this power soft top does have a hatch glass that opens much like the hard top does, and the door swings to the side, of course. It's a single door. We have a considerably narrower cargo opening here. It is 9 inches narrower, and the height of the cargo opening is a whopping 5 inches lower than the Grenadier. The Grenadier has the sort of classic dual door opening in the rear, but as we come over to this side, again, the height, it's really obvious. This is a consideration if you're trying to park in urban areas. I discovered that this vehicle, for instance, exactly as equipped, without the roof rails that we did buy with the Grenadier or the roof rack that we have, it is too tall to park in the San Francisco International Parking Garage. That is rather unfortunate, and I discovered that in probably the worst timing possible when I was almost late for a flight. Back here, we have a much bigger cargo opening. So this is considerably wider. Almost 4 feet wide, actually, between the door openings. A little bit over in terms of the opening width, a little bit under 4 feet wide between the wheel wells. It's a considerably larger and longer cargo area, about 3 inches longer in terms of depth, so you can fit much longer boxier items in here. The spare tire, of course, mounted on the back, just as you'd expect. The latter actually proves to be quite handy because of how tall the Grenadier is, and that's also why we find these load attachment points all the way around. So you can use these for securing your load, or of course for hopping up onto the roof. That's definitely something that, that you need to do with a roof this high. And this particular model also has these auxiliary electronic modules all the way around, where if you pull that off, there's actually a 12-volt power point right there. That's an option. So Grenadier was really thinking a lot about off-roading and accessorizing your vehicle and changing things. They've also said that these roof rails here, you can see the molding of the roof steel panel and the body steel panel here, they've been rolled together in a very traditional sort of rain rail attachment rail style, and these are structural, so you can use those to actually mount things to the vehicle. Of course, over here in the Wrangler, we have a look that's very similar, but these are much smaller and much sleeker, and then of course the roof comes off of the Wrangler, and that's the big thing with this model that a lot of folks like. Not only does the roof come off, the doors come off, the windshield folds down, you get that open air feeling. The Wrangler is America's best-selling convertible, if you didn't already know it. Over here in the Grenadier, nothing comes off. The doors are not designed to be user removable. They do have these exterior style hinges that are really attractive, but the door structure, etc., is just not designed to be removed from the vehicle easily. Clearly you could unbolt it if you wanted to, but you're probably not really going to want to do that. Now let's roll through some of the other key dimensional differences between these two vehicles. The Grenadier is a little bit longer, but it actually has the shorter wheelbase. That doesn't help it with the breakover angle, however, because of the tire size and the suspension design, etc., that we find over here in the Wrangler. This actually has better numbers all the way around. So better approach, breakover, and departure angles, although departure angles are actually pretty similar between the two vehicles. Turning circle, that is definitely better over here on the Wrangler. That may have to do with the kingpin design for the steering knuckles over here on the Grenadier, but any way you slice it, the Grenadier is going to take more three-point turns to get around your favorite trail than the Wrangler over here. They are both available with a front winch. You can get a front winch and a rear winch with the Grenadier. You can also do a front tow receiver on the front, so that way you can add on a winch later if you want to. This one over here, it was a recent addition to the 4xe. Previously, you couldn't combine 4xe with the winch. You'll also notice that we have the modular bumper on the Wrangler here, so you can remove these outer sections. It's going to give you a better attack angle on rocks. We have a somewhat similar looking design in the Grenadier, but you can't remove these outer sections here because those are actually used for some cooling for the engine, because we have a turbocharged engine in both of these, and the cooling design and cooling profile in the Grenadier is a little bit different, where they actually put some of the cooling modules behind the big steel bumper. It is, of course, a big steel bumper, just like we find over here in the Wrangler. The Grenadier is also quite a bit heavier due to its general design, and mostly seemingly the size of the axles on the Grenadier. They are extraordinarily large and heavy. They've really designed them to tuck underneath the body really nicely to give you a lot of coverage under there as far as ground clearance and of course rock protection, but it is quite a bit heavier. This Grenadier as equipped is right around 6,100 pounds. The plug-in hybrid 4xe, even with that nearly 18 kilowatt-hour battery pack, is about 800 or 900 pounds lighter at least, so significantly lighter over here in the Jeep. Now let's take a look at what's going on under the hood. One of the things I really liked about the Grenadier when I first saw it is the general hood design. I like how it has this dramatic V shape to it. It kind of goes with this sort of pre-war Citroen central grille section right there. And then of course this one also has the checker plates on each side. And those are load points, so you can actually mount them, you can actually stand on them. They're rated to be stood on, etc. We have a prop rod that can be relocated to another position right over here. Sometimes I get this wrong. Oh, I put it in backwards, but you can relocate the prop rod if you want the hood to be open a little bit higher. That's kind of a handy touch. And then again, the checker plates right here, these are rated to be stood on. So if for some reason you just wanted that over your engine look, or you want to strap things to your car, of course that's what that's for. Under here we have a BMW inline-six engine. It's a 3-liter turbocharged engine producing 282 horsepower. Rather sadly, the best engine available in the Grenadier is not available in North America. That's BMW's 3-liter inline-six. It's mated to an 8-speed ZF automatic transmission, a standard 2-speed transfer case, and your choice of a locking rear and front differential. oddly, the lockers are not standard. I would love to see that from Grenadier on the spec sheet, because that really would make this a pretty unique option. There is no plug-in hybrid system available, but rumor says we will probably get a hydrogen-powered Grenadier at some point in the future. And their next model in their lineup is going to offer a plug-in hybrid system. Other interesting thing about the Grenadier's four-wheel drive system is that you can have it in 4-low without the center coupling locked. Over here in the Jeep, we don't have a double pull to open the hood. Instead, we have, of course, the traditional Jeep latches on each side, and then you fish around under the hood for the latch, pop that open. This hood not only opens really tall, it's actually designed to go all the way back and rest very gently on the roof. Under this hood, we also find a turbocharged engine, but it's a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbo. It produces about 270 horsepower, and it's mated to 2 electric motors that bring the total power up to 375 horsepower, a whopping 470 pound-feet of torque. And that is, of course, thanks to the plug-in hybrid system. The approximately 18 kilowatt-hour battery pack is underneath the body between the frame elements in the back of the vehicle. And if you treat it nicely, you might get just over 20 miles of electric range. You'll also get a teeny tiny bump in fuel economy, and in real-world driving, the Wrangler will indeed be more fuel efficient than the Grenadier, although the Grenadier has actually surprised us over this approximately year and about 7,000 miles so far. This has been averaging around 18 miles per gallon. I really like the plug-in hybrid system in the Wrangler, not just for what's going on under the hood, but if I run back here to the cargo area for some of the extra features that might be handy off-road, like, for instance, this power distribution box right here. This guy plugs into the charge port, which is just in front of the driver's door. And if you plug this in, you can get a total of 30 amps, 120 volts out via these two outlets here. I am really surprised they didn't give us 240 volt output capability. The vehicle's not on, which is why it's flashing there. We also get a USB-C port. I'm not sure why there's just the one, but it is really handy to get 30 amps continuous out of this vehicle. So if you want to go camping and you want to have your blender out there for, margaritas as your party out there in your campsite, or a heater or an air conditioning or a refrigerator or a toaster oven or whatever you might want to power out there, or more logically perhaps, a big air compressor so it doesn't take so long to fill up these big huge tires after you've had to air them down, you can power this right from the 4xe. That's a really handy touch. And we don't find any corollary in the Grenadier. It does have an onboard inverter, but the output is pretty low, so I just opted not to get it. I believe it's around 400 watts output for the onboard inverter. I figured if I ever needed that, I would probably just have to put one on myself. Going in for a closer look underneath the vehicles, the Wrangler has complete underbody protection, skid plates pretty much everywhere. Over here, I'm not sure if you can really see that on the camera, but we have the ball joint designed front suspension, whereas over here in the Grenadier, we have the Kingpin up front. That's definitely a much more robust design. You can actually modify those into the Wrangler via a kit from Dana. Now over here on the Grenadier, one of the things that I've always been a little bit concerned about is the location of some of the cooling. So you can see that even though we have lots of skid plates going on there, we do have intercoolers, radiators, things like that in some of those more critical lower areas than we find on the Jeep. And again, inside these little outboard areas where we find removable sections on the Wrangler, in the Grenadier we find more cooling. Roof options are definitely one reason to get the Wrangler over the Grenadier, because there are a ton of different roof options. This one again is my favorite. It's the powered soft top. So it looks sort of like the hard top from the side. It is still removable, although it's a lot more complicated to remove than some of the other tops that are available on the Wrangler because of the power soft top design. You'll notice that over here, it doesn't open quite all the way to the rear passengers' heads, but I don't think that's a big problem because it's so big and so easy to use that I think this is going to get used more than the manual soft top that's available, and certainly more than the manual hard top, which is kind of a pain in the butt to actually get on and off the Wrangler. Over here in the Grenadier, we have, again, a much taller roof and a different optional design. So in the Jeep, The soft top is standard. Over here, if I can actually get this off, there we go. Over here, the safari windows, which are certainly iconic, these are optional in the Grenadier. So standard, we just have a regular roof. Optional, we have the safari panels. Mine actually did leak when we first got the vehicle. They fixed that and hasn't been a problem so far. Now on the subject of the safari windows, they are tinted, but I will say that I find two little flaws with these safari windows. The first one is, obviously, if you're caught in a rainstorm and you've packed them away in the bag in the trunk, you're gonna have to get it back out because they're not powered. They're latched on just like a 1970s sunroof would be. And then of course, they don't come with shades from the factory, and it can get pretty bright if you are actually in the desert out on safari. Now let's take a look at the interior, starting with the Grenadier, because this is probably going to be less familiar for most of the audience. Obviously, the first thing you're going to notice is the big central LCD. This has just the one. There is no separate instrument cluster. Instead, we just get what they call a telltale display, which is really just your warning lights there behind the steering wheel. If I had one complaint about this interior, that lack of separate instrument cluster is probably my only complaint. A little bit more of a minor complaint, I would say, is the fact that we don't have dual zone automatic climate control. It's just single zone climate control going on right there in the center. I love, however, the number of buttons and the style of the buttons and dials here, because it's not just what's going on there, it's also what's going on way up here. Because you can see we have this enormous airline style button bank. It kind of makes you feel like you're driving a 747. These are optional up here. This is part of the optional switch package. If you don't choose that, then the wiring harness in the vehicle is quite different, and it's going to be difficult to graft on afterwards. But we have a 500 amp outlet in the back of the vehicle. That's a really cool touch. It uses actually the same plug as NATO vehicles for its functionality, for simplicity. Up here we have the differential locks. I do think it's a little bit funky that the differential locks are up here in the ceiling. There's also the off-road mode over here and the wading mode. Exterior lights over there. We have the auxiliary lights that can only be used in the off-road mode. Over here we have the downhill assist and the stability control off button. So really well labeled. I think the knobs and switches are just a really cool touch as well. On this particular model, we chose the $800 option to get two pieces of brown leather. One over there for the grab handle on the passenger side, and then the brown steering wheel over here on this side. Another really cool touch, the Grenadier has 3 horns. So we have a regular dual note horn here, and then we have a smaller horn. It's actually a third horn for the toot horn. It has kind of a cheery little toot with a little bicycle icon on there. That's supposedly so that way you can honk at bicyclists and not have them scared. Although I'm not sure exactly how that would work in America. I think a lot of bicyclists would just get really offended because we just generally don't honk at cyclists here. On this central display, we have wireless CarPlay functionality, so that is kind of a nice touch. And then we have also, if I go to the off-road page, we have some pretty typical off-road screens, but the interaction of these screens is a little on the slow side. Now you can also control, for instance, this display using a control wheel a little bit lower on the dashboard, but I find it a bit easier to use the touchscreen display instead. One thing you'll notice missing here is that we don't have factory navigation at all for any price. Now moving all the way down the dashboard, sorry, there is a third piece of brown leather. It's the wrap on the parking brake right there. We have the typical BMW shifter that we find in a wide variety of different BMWs. The mechanical controller for the locker. This is the transfer case locker, so high, low, and lock. And that's what's important here. You can be high range or low range open, or high and low locked. So you do have a lot more choice here than you find in the average off-road vehicle. We then have the rotary knob controller for that infotainment system right there. I prefer not using that. A little bit of shiny black plastic there. 2 pretty decent cup holders. But the other thing you'll notice about this interior is that the seats are significantly wider than in the Wrangler, and they're further apart. So we measured the couple distance, so center of the driver's seat to the center of the passenger seat. These seats are about 4.5 inches further apart than in the Wrangler, and that's why we have this wider center console here. Of course, it's not a very big storage area under there. You can see you have a power port. I stuff our trailer brake controllers in there, for instance. That's what's going on inside. No factory trailer brake controller for the 7,700 pounds of trailering capability. And you'll notice right here on the dashboard, there is actually a key in the dashboard because no keyless go. Other things you don't find in here, no automatic high beams, something that we definitely find in the Wrangler. Also, no adaptive cruise control. So if you're looking for some of those newer features and functions, you won't find them here. Now let's talk about seats and the roominess in the cabin. Obviously, with the tall roofline, we have lots of headroom in here. It's really obvious that the roofline is pretty high. The thing that's not as obvious, though, is that the rear seats are also notably higher off the ground than in the Wrangler. The rear seats are also higher off the ground than the front seats in the Grenadier. That gives me a little bit more thigh support because the seat bottom cushion is a little bit higher, but the floorboards, those are also higher off the ground than the front. Legroom, pretty generous. This front seat's comfortably adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, actually a little bit further back in its tracks than I would normally sit, but I still have several inches of legroom. And this is one of the few off-road vehicles sold in the US right now that would comfortably accommodate a 6 foot to 6'1" person up front and a large rear-facing convertible seat behind. There's just a lot of room in here. But if I go up front, my one complaint about the Grenadier is that the front seats are actually not that comfortable. There is a lack of lumbar support that I find particularly unusual about these seats, so I find myself using an inflatable extra lumbar support. Also, the seats are entirely manual here. You can get heated seats, but we just don't find the same sort of luxury seating experience that you might expect to get in an approximately $90,000 SUV, and this can get quite expensive. Now let's take a look at the Rubicon, starting with the back seats. First thing I noticed is that step in can actually be a little bit easier. It's kind of tricky with both of these because the roof line is low. The door opening, however, is about the same height as the roof line. So if I scoot over to this side, you'll notice a few things going on. Because this is a convertible, they need the structural support in the body. So we have this big bar right here. This contains the speakers on the top. It also has a GPS antenna, map lights, things like that right there across the front. And that means that if you're a little bit too aggressive in your off-roading, your rear passengers may actually end up hitting their head on that bar or hitting their head on the bar behind if they're not really careful with the head restraints. The roof line itself is definitely lower, so we definitely have less headroom here. The power sunroof model, it's actually not a problem, I think. As far as headroom goes, we have reasonable thigh support in the back. Again, kind of a stadium seating affair where these seat cushions are a little bit higher off the ground than the front seating cushions. A little bit flatter of a floor, a little bit narrower in the back as well. And with the driver's seat comfortably adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, I have a little bit less legroom than we find in the Grenadier with the seat in that position. The big difference, of course, versus the Ineos is that because the roof line is so much lower, I really could not move this seat in much more of an upright position and still be comfortable in the front to try and compensate for a child seat behind or something like that. So it's gonna be a little bit trickier. But these seats are a lot more comfortable. We have 4-way adjustable lumbar support, a power seat mechanism. This is the first time in decades and decades and decades that we actually have powered seats in the Wrangler, and it really does improve the comfort and the adjustability. So if you've been in a Wrangler before and maybe your spouse or your partner or your other driver in the household is just not comfortable finding a good position in the Wrangler before, they may actually be able to do so now because there's just more variability with the seat design. We also have a tilt telescopic steering column with, I think, a slightly better range of motion and more obviously an instrument cluster right where you'd expect it to be in the middle of everything. And if that doesn't beat all, we also have keyless go and adaptive cruise control with more controls in the steering wheel. On the downside, just 2 horns. Now obviously with the roof open, this interior looks a lot brighter than the interior of the Grenadier. You can see that partial LCD instrument cluster over there. We have a small LCD in the middle of everything and then the analog gauges on the side. The controls for the adaptive cruise control over there on the right side of the steering wheel. The controls for that multifunction LCD on the other side. We also have 2-zone automatic climate control. It's pretty obvious that even though the Jeep is still an off-road oriented vehicle, they've spent a lot of time really focusing on creature comforts and things that a 21st century person might logically expect to find in their new vehicle. The first thing we're going to do in the Grenadier is start out in 4-low, because again, this is one of the big features of the Grenadier. I'm in 4-low, there is 0 binding as I have the steering wheel turned super tight. Now, on the downside, I could do a complete circle in this part of my driveway in the Jeep. And in the Grenadier, it just doesn't turn tightly enough for that. So it definitely takes a bit more effort to actually go around the circle. But you could, for whatever reason you might want to, drive out on the open highway on regular pavement in 4-low in the Grenadier if you wanted to. Because again, true center differential, open or locked, your choice. Now, if I was in a situation where I did need the extra traction, I can simply move this lever over to the right while I'm driving, and then it's gonna lock the center. If I don't need it anymore, move it over to the left, unlock the center. Then of course, I have the rear differential locker here too. So I can lock the rear differential, but there are certain conditions for locking the front and rear locker, and that is one of the unusual twists. So they really do want you to do the same sort of progressive locking that you find in the Jeep first. So once the center is locked, then I can lock the rear. So wait for it, and it should be locked here in just a moment. And yep, it has fully locked. So now we are just about as locked as you'd get in the Jeep. And of course, then we can engage the front locker if you want to as well. If you disengage the lockers in this vehicle, then it does take a little bit of time for the system to actually react. And there is a little bit of a reason for that, according to Grenadier. They said that they wanted the systems and the software in the vehicle to actually measure wheel speed, make sure that things have unlocked fully before they turn off all the little displays on the center console displays here, etc. So it's something to keep in mind. Some reviewers have been a little bit confused about that in the Grenadier. They assumed that maybe things didn't unlock properly. That's not what's going on. Now, like most vehicles like this, you do have to shift to neutral in order to actually change the ratio from low to high. But you don't have to come to a stop if you want to engage the center locker when you're in high. You again shift that lever over to the right. Now we're in high ratio and locked, or high ratio and unlocked. I truly appreciate the flexibility that we get in this system. The downside on the trail for the Grenadier is obviously going to be its size and its turning circle. This does not cut a corner nearly as tightly as the Wrangler. And that is despite the fact that we have basically the same track width as the Wrangler and a shorter wheelbase, where you would think that maybe we'd have a tighter turning radius. The wheels, they just don't turn as tight in the Grenadier. On the other hand, we have lots of pep, but again, we don't have a stability control system that is quite as good as the one in the Wrangler. It feels good, it sounds good in here. You'll really hear that BMW Turbo 6 engine sound. I think it sounds fantastic. But when the going starts going, you'll notice that beeping. We have a few unusual things here. The speed monitoring system that's letting you know you're exceeding the speed limit. Supposedly it should be adjustable at some point as far as saving that preference. Here, every time you turn off the vehicle and turn it on, you have to turn off that overspeed warning, because even 1 mile per hour over the speed limit, it's gonna beep, 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 beep at you. The software, it's not fully baked. Let's be totally honest, the Grenadier is not about the software. It's also not about on-road driving dynamics. The design of the axles, the design of the suspension, the design of the steering, etc., this drives like a very classic old SUV, more like a tractor if I'm honest. The steering is heavy, the steering is vague, it doesn't return to center. I'm sure you've all heard that before. It is all definitely true. For me, more annoying is that it requires more constant correction to keep the vehicle exactly where you intend it to go. It's not going to be as quick. 0 to 60 in this is a little over 8.5 seconds. 60 to 0 stopping distance, it's over 120 feet, even with the more on-road focused tires we have on this model. And you can just thank the curb weight for that. The other oddity with the Grenadier, though, is the cabin noise. It's relatively loud in here, and it's going to depend greatly on the road surface. If you're on a rougher road surface, it's like being inside a drum. Just the way the rear body panels, etc., interact with the vibrations. The whole back of the vehicle can become a sounding board. So on those longer road trips, it may get a little bit tiring, a little bit drony. On the other hand, when the roads start getting a little bit narrower like this, you'll notice you're really going to be spending a lot more time and effort hustling the steering wheel around. Out on a trail, or even out here in my driveway, the Wrangler feels more nimble because it has a much tighter turning radius. The wheel actually isn't all the way cranked, and I can do a complete circle this part of my driveway, because we have a 40-degree steering angle left or right versus 32 degrees in the Grenadier. So this just turns much tighter. There is a problem though. Right now I'm in 4 auto, which doesn't have a full lock of the center. If I move this over to 4 low, like I was in the Grenadier, then you'll immediately hear the difference. Tires start scrabbling around. Oh, and now I'm up there on the side there. I'm also tearing up my driveway, so I'm gonna have to address that later with my box grader. But the turning circle also extends out a little bit. So now, ooh, I'm really close to that tree. You'll notice a big difference both in the feel and in the capability of this, because you cannot be in 4 low without that being locked. You also don't get the advantage of 4 high part time unless you have it in that mode. In the 4 auto mode, we have a clutch pack, and it's going to try and connect and disconnect the front axle whenever it senses slip, whenever it feels that that is necessary. And that's not going to be quite as sure-footed feeling, especially on ice, snow, etc., versus the Grenadier. On the other hand, we have the ability to move this into 2 high and save fuel when we want to. We also, of course, have the option to move over to the electric mode because the vehicle actually was standing there. Oh, there we go. The engine just turned off. So we have the ability to drive electric only. And that's a really cool touch. This is one of a very, very small number of plug-in hybrid convertibles around the world. And as far as I know, it's the only one that's offered in the United States at the moment. A lot has been said about how the Wrangler drives out on the road or out on the trail like this. Some people have said, you know, oh, the death wobble is horrible. You know, the steering is vague, the steering is numb, there's too much effort, too little effort. All of that has been levied at the Wrangler. But I think driving these 2 vehicles back to back really just proves how much time and effort, billions of dollars, decades and decades of research has gone into making the Wrangler drive as well as it does. And given the fact that it has a relatively short wheelbase, it's a relatively small vehicle, body on frame, solid axles front and rear, the Wrangler really drives very, very well for what it is. And this pairing really highlights that. It, however, also highlights why the Bronco has gone to an independent suspension, because the reality is people drive on roads like that or roads like this far more often than they drive on a true off-road trail or go rock crawling or go to Moab, etc. Most people are going to be driving on roads like this, and they're going to think to themselves, wow, I went off-road. I know a decent number of people that think gravel roads are off-road, and they're not. And that's why, honestly, the 4xe makes so much sense for me, because I could do at least half of my daily commute electric only. Admittedly, I'd have to charge on both ends, but that would have a pretty dramatic reduction in my gasoline consumption versus the Grenadier or versus a regular Wrangler. You also have the silent crawling capability and a whole heap more power. This model went 0 to 60 in about 6.5 seconds, so it's significantly faster than the Grenadier and significantly faster than all of the other Wranglers except for the 6.4-liter Hemi. On the other hand, if you are interested in the most off-road capable version of the Wrangler and the smoothest feel off-road, then I wouldn't get the 4xe. Because of the way this hybrid system is designed, if you're in 4 low and you're in electric or hybrid mode, the transitions between those modes can be a little bit peculiar. If you really need all the torque of the combined engine and motor systems working for you, then the clutch engagement inside the transmission is just not the smoothest, and that becomes a little bit of a functional problem, for me at least, when we're talking about off-road performance. On the other hand, again, we have the powered top functionality, which is very civilized. We have steering that doesn't require as much effort. It returns to center. We have adaptive cruise control. We have 2-zone automatic climate control. We have an instrument cluster where you'd expect it to be. The Wrangler has become really very, very civilized over the last few generations, and civilized in a way that, you know, has left some people feeling perhaps a little bit empty. Maybe they want something that brings them back to an era where Wranglers were more hardcore and were more compromised for the off-road capability. And if that describes you, then maybe the Grenadier is going to be the better fit. If, on the other hand, you want something that handles a bit better, is quieter out on the road, doesn't have funky rumbles from things going on there, and is definitely significantly faster when you need to pass a cyclist safely, then you probably want something like this. And then, of course, we have the ability to shift some of your consumption over to electricity. We should talk a bit about that here too. This has a relatively small gas tank. And according to the gauges when we got it and it was completely full, we should be able to get about 250 miles out of the gas tank. Plugging it in when possible at home and at the office, we have been able to stretch out the effective gas tank to over 700 miles. And that's the big benefit to the plug-in hybrid system. It's not overly efficient, whether we're talking about electric mode or gasoline mode because of the tires, the shape, etc. But it is going to be more efficient than it otherwise would be. And it does mean that you don't have to feel quite as guilty about getting a Wrangler if you are worried about the emissions, the consumption, etc. You have the choice of being a little bit lighter, of course, on your pocketbook as well, and having a Wrangler still.